Welcome to Drupal Night, sponsored by Bio-Rack. Tonight we've got Dani and Salem talking about design systems. Take it away, guys.
Thanks.
Hello, how are you? I cannot guarantee I'll be standing up the whole time. I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm not as mobile as I normally am. So we're here to talk to you specifically about creating design systems that allow your team to create really great experiences that are consistent and functional, and to have a single source of truth that goes across a number of different websites rather than something that's just focused on front-end code or just focused on visual design.
And that single source of truth, have that scale and grow along with you, your company, your team.
So let's talk just a little bit. We'll keep the shameless plug minimal. I'll try to get out of the way so that we're not blocking the slide. Salem and I work for a company called Pegasystems. Pegasystems builds customer engagement software. In other words, we leverage synergies to engage customers in digital transformation.
Any questions? We build software to help our clients, our customers, solve really complex, really large problems in how they do business, and to help them build software.
Yes. And so our team, the digital team, actually governs all of Pega's corporate website. So there are three main properties. We have Pega.com, which is obviously our corporate marketing site. We also have Sales Hub, which is an internal document portal for our sales organization. And we have the PDN, which is our developer network. Think Drupal.org for Pega. It's really developer documentation, how to learn stuff. It helps people figure out how to use the software and how to troubleshoot it. 3 different sites, all on Drupal 7 currently.
And we have 2 more exciting properties in the pipeline for 2017. 2 brand new ones to add to the existing 3.
Technically, possibly 3.
Actually, we're technically at 4 right now with accounts.
Sure.
So a lot of Drupal sites.
Many sites.
And what really excites me is Pega.com and PDN are both moving to Drupal 8 in 2017 as well.
Mm-hmm. And part of that is the reason we're doing this. So I'm Dani Nordin, and I am the Director of Digital User Experience at Pegasystems. So what I do is I run a small but motley crew of UX professionals and focus on helping the team create exceptional experiences at speed and scale. I also tend to geek out on process, and I'm always putting my team through making them guinea pigs for all of my little process things, and they're very patient and lovely about it. And that's the cutest kid you'll ever see, so just so you know. Except I don't know what this one's going to look like, but it'll be that cute.
Hi everybody, I'm Salem. I'm the front-end architect at Pega on the digital team. That's me running the Disney Marathon earlier this year. I know, crazy. I work with Dani and Colleen and Kelly, along with a lot of other stakeholders at Pega, to build out scalable, modular, maintainable, front-end systems. That includes CSS, HTML, JavaScript, but it also is more and more increasingly involving our design system, which is really what we're talking about tonight. I also really hate documentation, but we'll get to that in a few minutes.
So I want to give you a little background on the way we used to do this. We used to do things before Salem arrived and before we started moving towards an integrated digital design system. So we had a directive from the CEO for a very long time, which was to make our properties consistent. We want this to feel like no matter what property you're at the same company. And of course, because the CEO wants to just sort of dictate a solution, he's like, well, why don't you guys just use templates? Now, we know that's not going to really work. This is not 1999. We're not using front page. But even then, one of our major stakeholders is marketing. And marketing needs to evolve. They need to be able to experiment with things, see what converts, see what works well. And so we would have these design components that were based in Pega.com that would be constantly shifting and evolving. And we would be constantly iterating on that site. But the way that we were handling this visual consistency. And this was, a lot of these decisions were made before I arrived at Pega. We're just taking the patterns that were in use on Pega.com and the components that were used on Pega.com and just sort of lifting them wholesale and plopping them in the other site without really thinking about the different needs or different audiences of those particular sites. And because we didn't have a system that integrated with the front end code of these sites, if we made a change on Pega.com, there would be rework required to actually integrate those changes across a different website.
Right.
Rework that was never prioritized and basically never done. So to give you an example of how that works, this is the current homepage of Pega.com. This, several elements of this page have changed drastically in the year, like slightly over a year that I've been here. For example, the navigation we've changed several times. The way we treat the hero space has changed several times. But we've maintained this sort of block with a colored background and white text. We've shifted things slightly, but it's still basically been the same. On Sales Hub, which the design was finishing up before when I was starting, this was the approach they took. Now remember what I said Sales Hub is. This is a way to find sales pitches and documents, and it's primarily a search engine. Does this look like a search engine?
That looks easy to find what I need.
PDN is our developer network. It houses all of our documentation. It has discussion forums where you can find and get answers. And it has pretty comprehensive tutorials on how to build things with our software. But when we redesigned PDN, we started taking patterns directly from Pega.com and just putting them on the PDN because we wanted the look and feel to be the same. In the meantime, if you look at heat mapping data, nobody scrolls past the top of that headline where it says, "Are you on Pega 7?" Nobody scrolls past it. And if you see usability tests, nobody really interacts with the top banner at all. They usually will go straight to search or they'll go straight to the navigation. They interact not at all with the homepage when they get there because it doesn't have information that's at all relevant to them. Now, where this all hit ahead was right around the time that I arrived, a couple months after I arrived. We released new product pages. So we redesigned the pages that we used to sell our product. And the marketing team's designer came up with this really, relatively interesting design. It was very big, bold, in-your-face marketing. You've got a nice big picture, nice big hero area, and these three sort of key points.
Key points, key features.
And then there's these blades underneath, right? So you've got this thing with that classic thing. It's like a band across the screen with a picture, and then like these things. Okay.
It's a marketing website.
It's a marketing website. So then we had to make these landing pages for content on the PDN. Now, the purpose of these pages is to figure out how to build user interfaces with Pega. And the designer who was working for me at the time basically just took the same patterns that they had used for the product pages and they used them in this context. And we ended up with this, which is on the marketing's website, and then this, which is supposed to teach you how to design a user interface.
See the problem?
Yeah, so what ended up happening, and this was like my second month that this was happening. And what ended up happening was that people who worked on the PDN, who actually created content on the PDN, felt like they weren't being heard at all. That our team was just throwing stuff from Pega.com onto a page and saying, this is what you get. We don't care what your audience needs. Which, considering that my team specializes in user-centered design, is not really the vibe you want them to get. And it didn't really respect the point of the content and what people were there to do. And so that one single project had already been going on for something like 7 months when I arrived. It took another 8 months to launch.
Just for reference, it probably takes...
We built the entire PDN on Drupal 7 in 3 months.
Yeah, I've launched like 3 or 4 sites in like a year. So,
So what do we do?
So that's easy. We go to Atomic Design.
Yeah, solves all the problems.
Done. Quick show of hands. Who here knows about Atomic Design, Pattern Lab? You guys don't count. Okay. We got a lot to cover. So if you know about it, fantastic. If you don't, go Google it. It's really awesome. There's a ton of talks about Atomic Design with Brad Frost. So Atomic Design, is a methodology that is part of our larger encompassing design system. And that's really the way that we're solving a lot of these overarching problems that we're having.
And the main point, just to give a quick overview, the main point is that you're not thinking of design in terms of a layout. A big layout, here's a single page and what that single page looks like. You're breaking it down to smaller chunks and smaller components, and you can use those components in all of these different ways to achieve a given effect. Sound like anything else we know?
Sounds like
Modular?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
paragraphs.
that
maybe?
kind of thing.
Yeah.
So,
Obviously, there's a lot of nuanced details on how you do this. We'll get through some of those tonight. Needless to say, though, moving towards a design system-driven way of working gives us a lot of huge wins. In technical debt, reducing it over time, in helping with our site's performance, in really iterating and delivering new features and new functionality a lot faster, both from like a development front end and back end perspective, but also from how Dani and I and our teams work together to go from concept, get it in the browser as soon as possible, and get the thing shipped.
mm-hmm. It's also very wonderful to sit in a meeting with the CEO and watch his eyes do this when you say, and by the way, our design system also hooks in with our front-end code. So if we change something in the design system, it automatically populates to the website. It's quite the lovely thing.
Did you know that Salesforce has a design system?
They do.
They do. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but basically, I think this was taken a couple months after I started at Pega. I was curious, how is our design system, how is this new front-end architecture, how does that actually impact measurable improvements in our CSS code quality? Basically, this column here is what is it's the most important bit of information here. I don't know if you guys can read that. It's 838% less code moving from our monolithic CSS special child of code to where the design system is going right now. Granted, it's still evolving, it's still changing, but 838% less code sounds pretty awesome.
So, we're done, right?
Yep,
Yep. Everything's done.
we're done.
Fabulous success.
Atomic Design, that's it.
Yeah, no. The problem that we see there, I don't know if you noticed this, and this is a problem with the way that we talk about atomic design and the way that we typically talk about design systems and pattern libraries and all this other stuff. Did you hear anything about design? That was all front-end code, right? And so there's lots of benefits to that, but designers don't think that way. Designers aren't going to grab a chunk of HTML and throw it into their web page. And so the thing that you have to figure out is, how do you actually document this design system in a way that's not just going to work for the front-end developers, but is also going to work for the designers on the top.
And the back-end developers, and the content authors.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody.
So then we come up with the challenge of, how do you actually document this in a way that's useful to all of the people using it? And there's a couple of ways we used to do it.
And when I mentioned earlier that I hate documentation, this is what I mean. This is the kind of documentation that I hate.
So now this is something that the marketing team actually puts together for marketers to actually put together the content for their pages.
Editorial guidelines, image size specs, maintenance schedules, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
This is 47 pages and it was updated about 18 months ago.
And the page has completely changed since then.
Like
So-
everything. Everything's
So
changed.
The documentation that was that 47 pages of documentation is now completely obsolete. And it's sitting on a shared drive somewhere. This is something that our old designer put together when he started to get a grounding in how we were doing things on Pega.com when we started.
It's like the quintessential PDF style guide.
Except it's all wrong. Everything's changed since then. And I don't know if you've picked up on this. You may not be a designer and you may not care. The only color that's not gray is the world's ugliest blue. So one of the things that we realized really quickly was that we didn't even have enough variety to do anything meaningful with our design work because our palette was so limited. But how do we actually expand that in a way that also is functional, also shows some restraint, and
also is actually updated, actually maintained, and we don't end up in this situation again.
So there are lots of reasons why static documentation works. It's really easy to put together. You can probably put it together in an hour or two. And it's pretty easy to pass along from person to person. But that doesn't mean it's not without its problems.
We have to understand that these artifacts that we create, we painstakingly craft. It's no different than a website. It has to be maintained over time. It has to be, owned by somebody. And in all of my experience, this just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen intentionally, but for whatever reason, over time, these artifacts sit on a shelf somewhere or on a network drive somewhere and are just completely irrelevant. They also lack contextual awareness. And what I mean by contextual awareness is, like we saw on the earlier slides with these UI patterns on Pega.com and trying to apply the same ones to PDN, these static artifacts don't understand, it might look the same, but maybe this particular pattern is more appropriate for these particular content or user-centric goals. That's a lot of information to communicate in PDF form.
And another thing that tends to happen especially with static documentation, is it doesn't really represent the thing that's going to be output. So it'll give you sort of general guidelines, like this is how we handle imagery, this is how headlines are treated, this is the fonts that we can use, these are the colors that we can use. It doesn't really give you guidance on how to use it. And when you're constructing a digital experience, that kind of leeway can lead to a lot of haphazard decisions being made. And people don't realize it because, well, I used the fonts you told me to.
But the fonts are responsive. They change at your breakpoint.
So everybody needs something different from their documentation. And where so many pattern libraries and so many style guides stop is they just throw up an instance of Pattern Lab, throw a bunch of components in there, use it as the basis for their website, and then they're done.
Call it a day. Yeah.
But then
how does design work with that? How does UX work with that? How does Drupal, how does Kelly and his team, how do all these other contributors to our digital presence, how do they use those kinds of assets?
And what ends up happening, because there's no real explanation, what happens is the people who are forced to use these things don't use them and just come up with their own special snowflake comps. And then people like Salem either have to argue with them, say, well, that's not in the design system, or have to figure out, okay, well, I guess I have to create a new pattern. And so they spend all of this time doing rework, and it leads to these very fractured experiences. So we need to do a couple of things with our design system. One is we need to establish guidelines for how we use it, how we use these things. We also want to have practical tools. So it's not just about you have a website where you can go and see all the things.
Here's some code, let me just copy and paste that.
It's also about understanding, here's a toolkit I can use to make design easier so I can focus on the really important things, like who is the person coming to this, what content do they need, and how do we get them from A to B?
So there's a lot involved of different parts that are involved in a design system. We have the style guide. We have usage and best practices and tone and the design principles that Dani was mentioning. And there's other things. There's how do we code? What's the standard that we've set for all of our new developers coming on board? What are the components that are available? How should Drupal get wired up to these things? There's a lot involved. There's a lot of different moving parts involved in a design system. And we're still figuring out how some of these things fit in. If Pattern Lab is the right tool for it, or maybe there's a more appropriate other place that ties into this. But just keep in mind that this covers a decent amount here, but it's never going to include everything. Not how this system's been evolving.
So what we want to present now is a set of, now that you have this background, we want to set up some very quick principles for how you can start moving your design system to the next level. And then Salem is going to give you a demo of some of the things that we're doing with our design system and talk a little bit about some of the architectural decisions he's made from the front end that are helping us improve the quality of the experiences we deliver. So the first principle is to start with the basics. And I don't mean fonts and colors. Although those are important.
We still need those.
We still need those. But you need to understand who is going to be using this design system, who is responsible for making things on the website. And like I said, this is where most talks on design systems and pattern libraries fall short, because they always assume that it's the front-end developer. They don't think about UI designers. They don't think about marketers and tech writers and visual designers and all of the people who actually create content on this website. And then they also don't really take into account the different tool sets that these groups use. I am not a believer in unicorns. I know a lot of us have tried it, and it's great, but it's actually much more limiting, because you never get the chance to specialize, you never get the chance to grow in one particular area and become really good at it. So our designers don't use code all the time. Our designers have standardized on Axure and on Sketch. We have one designer who works in Adobe Experience Manager, and we have designers who work in Photoshop. No.
I actually like Photoshop. Anyways.
But either way, we also have marketers that work in PowerPoint. We have executives that work in PowerPoint. What are they going to need? How do they get access to our colors so that it's easy for them to figure it out? So part of what we've done, and part of what we're working towards with the design system, is not just having the components in front-end code, but also having them as sketch elements, as Axure widgets. So it's really easy for anyone on the team to create a layout just by grabbing something from the library and putting it on the page and modifying it. And what that does is gives us the ability to stay consistent and to choose from essentially a bento box full of patterns.
The patterns themselves stay synced together, but the format and the kind of way that you want to use the thing, it's going to differ based on your needs, based on who you fit in, where you fit in on all this.
And what that means for us as an organization is that our designers and our developers and our content authors get to focus their energy on the stuff that's really, really important. The content, the interaction, how does someone actually get to this page, and what do we want them to do once they get on that page? From there, you also want to understand, are there any other use cases that you need to think about? So are there, how often are you going to have to onboard new people? What's the information they need to get an understanding of how to use the design system? Do you have third-party vendors that you use? Do you have interns that are going to be with you for the summer? Are there people who are remote and you need to be able to send them the design system, or they need to be able to use a piece of the design system really quickly? And then on top of that, you also want to think about executives and external audiences. Building a design system takes time. It takes energy. It's something that has to be on the roadmap. How else do you get your stakeholders who are deciding what you get to spend money on that this is a worthwhile investment, that this is something that needs a roadmap, that needs to be evolved, that needs to evolve over time? From there, you start documenting your actual design standards. So it's not just, when we talk about atomic design, we usually think of atoms as your headlines, your typography, your colors. But we also want to make sure that we have actual information about how we use these things, why we use these things. Why did we choose this font? Why did we choose the other font?
When is it appropriate? What are the do's and don'ts for this thing? What are the best practices?
And one of the places that we find most important to show that is actually with color. Because if you've got a color palette, I don't know if you've ever seen Material Design's color palette, but it's something like 347 colors, and they're all just sort of together.
They got all the colors.
And that's totally fine, but you could easily find a designer wreaking havoc with that.
You can want to have a balance between, enabling designers to be creative and to try new things, but you want to have some constraints.
Yeah. So you want to make sure that if there are any things that are really important for creating good design, that you lay those out in the design system as part of that overall documentation. One of the issues that we came up with recently was a question about spacing. We needed standards on spacing, because otherwise, if you didn't have an explicit declaration of, for example, how much space should exist between a headline and the copy below it, then Salem had nothing to go on, and so he would create a layout that was just sort of all over the place.
Yeah,
and nothing was connected and nothing belonged together. So we realized, okay, the system has to adjust. So we came up with something called the rule of eights. A headline and body copy should never be more than about 8 pixels away from each other. Paragraphs should be about 16 pixels away, and major elements should be about 24 pixels away from each other. That way, each piece of the layout makes sense. It all looks grouped together.
It's easy to add that to all the new components that we're building out. It's scalable. We can update it over time. Maybe we don't want to use rule of eights. Maybe we want to use rule of 10. We have to be able to upgrade and change the system over time.
Mm-hmm. And finally, the last thing is to establish very clear design principles that you put in the design system and you display with it. And the reason you do that is twofold. One, you want everyone in the team to be on the same page as to why you do the things you do. But also, this is really very much for the executive stakeholders who are going to be viewing this, because it lends credibility to what you do. It says we're not just doing this to have a design system, we're doing this because it helps us do better work, and here are the philosophies that we have. And so now we get into the fun thing.
So I've got some slides covering some of what we'll be walking through.
And I do want to do a time check to make sure that we didn't talk forever.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Cool. But before I maybe go back to the slides and open the floor for questions, let's just do a quick demo and show some examples on what we're actually talking about. Okay, awesome. Let's start with color, because color palettes are a pretty basic staple to most design systems. So, remember that slide we had earlier about the color palette in our static PDF style guide, getting out of date, out of sync? So we've got a color palette here. We've got some swatches. We have our secondary colors. We have gradient options. Pretty typical. These don't go out of date. These don't get out of sync, ever. If we have colors in our all-encompassing design system, if we put our design decisions in the right place in the code, in our CSS, in our SAS, this automatically becomes up to date with every single change that you make. This doesn't become irrelevant.
Is it possible to have several color schemes so that for one application it might be this like red scheme, one might be this blue? The rest of the atoms are the same, or the molecules? But
Yes.
you just say, I need a different color scheme.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, actually.
We do that with our applications.
So that's what, depending on how you're looking at the system, because it's the same thing, but you could look at it from different angles. Our different high-level product categories have a unique color palette treatment that we have as part of our brand guidelines.
This is slightly different though, because so what BioWrap does, I just want to interrupt, because what BioWrap does is they actually have 5 different applications, so it's a little more like one application is going to have a blue scheme, one is going to have a green scheme, and that's going to be a bunch of different colors across the applications, whereas the way we use it is really more in a marketing context. Like this little patch of gradient represents that product wherever it's mentioned.
Oh,
More
sure,
like,
sure.
say the default would all be in grayscale, and
Mhm.
you've got value, 5 different values, and
Yep.
then when we say, oh, let's do the blue version, replace the grayscale with blue, let's do the red version, replace that grayscale with red, with those different values, and being able to capture that in your atoms to say this is a different scheme. Everything else is the same though.
So to answer your question, the design system, even though we don't have any complex collections of color palettes that this property gets this collection of color options, this other one gets a different set. We don't have a current need of doing theming like that at the moment, but the system, especially from like a CSS architectural standpoint, actually already supports that. It supports it in, I want to just make this the light theme or the dark theme or the red theme.
Mm-hmm.
It supports it in that respect, but it also supports having unique design detail differences between properties.
It might be useful to show the lighter and darker, because that sort of speaks to what you're talking about. So we have 2 primary colors. One is blue, one is gray. And we have a naming scheme that goes from lightest to darkest. And so I don't know how you would do this technically. Salem's probably a little more adept than I am. Or, well, I mean, I would imagine he definitely is, or else why did we hire him? But, but the idea is that in your component, you would basically say, okay, use the lighter here, use the lightest here. And so it speaks a little to that grayscale, but then the overall theme is blue.
Right. Okay.
So it would be similar to that, and it's pretty flexible because you can actually. What's nice about it is it's flexible because it's not based on any kind of like mix-in. It's not like a calculation. So you can actually have a. You can actually say, for example, our color. So on our color palette, we have our grays actually go from warm to cool. So our lighter grays are actually warmer and our darker grays are cooler. And so they're actually different hex values and even different color families. So that structure, I think, works very well with what you're talking about.
It also, so it's a combination of like hand curated, maybe some of these values aren't automatically generated.
Mm-hmm.
They could be though. We're still kind of exploring like with how the swatches themselves are generated.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe for our grays, it doesn't make sense for us to try to, simplify how we define our colors and try to programmatically generate them. Maybe it doesn't make sense for our grays, but our blues are actually really, really close to the same shade of blue,
Mm-hmm.
just with different levels of lightness and darkness.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be great, and we're maybe gonna try to get this out the door in a couple weeks as a proof of concept. But it'd be really great if we could just say this is blue for all the things that are blue in the system, and when we need to add another shade that's darker or lighter, it knows, oh, I just need to go 10% or 20% darker, or 30 or 40% darker. That way, when we need to do a darkest or darkestest, when we reach that point, we'll probably need to change the naming convention of these. But all of the tools and the approaches for this kind of thing are designed to scale and change over time. even how we're picking the different colors, from a front-end developer standpoint, I don't know what the hex value is for our blue, and it's used everywhere. But I don't know what that hex is. So, and I also don't want to memorize, dozens and dozens of different variables. So from a coding standpoint, I just say, hey, give me the blue color from our palette. Go run the Sass palette function and pick the blue value, or pick the blue dark value. Mm-hmm. So that when this hex value does change, I don't need to rememorize another variable. And
I don't even need to replace it anywhere in the code.
There's literally one single place in the entire code base for that shade of blue, and if I need to change it, I change it. Nothing else cares or needs to know that it's changed.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to show the icons?
Yeah. So the icons are another thing I've found in the past are, they're challenging from a couple different standpoints. One of the most common reoccurring questions I've had as a front-end developer, as a front-end architect, is actually from designers saying, what icon options do I have? Like, where do I find that icon? Or, hey, do we have like a share icon for this thing? What does it look like? Where can I find our icons? Especially if we're working with any outside contractors or agencies, something simple like icons can be really tricky. So the first cool thing about this is all the icons that we have on the page here, these are all of the icons that are currently shipped. So these are literally the icons that any property that is consuming the design system now has access to, regardless of what property it is. That's the first cool thing. So if I decided, I need to get a new icon for how we represent our PDFs, as soon as it's available here in the design system, and we call this PegaKit, Pega Toolkit. As soon as it's available here, any other property at that point can then start to pull it in. Another thing that is that we kind of noticed when we had a giant page of here's all the icons is it could be hard to find what you're looking for exactly. Email, Facebook. Sometimes the name of the actual file isn't always. It doesn't make sense. It's not intuitive. So another thing we've been kind of exploring is having the ability to search and filter quickly, but also having the ability to add additional metadata to your icons themselves, so that even though I might not know, it's the Twitter icon or it's the LinkedIn no space no dash icon, I could say social and I still can find the relevant information that I'm looking for. Mm-hmm. The download link here too, that's also dynamic. So anytime any of these assets get changed, the zip file of all the SVG icons that we have here, that always gets auto-generated and rebuilt every time we make a change too.
One of the other things that we want to do, so those are some of the ways that we treat atoms. And we want to show you one last thing before we open the floor for questions, which is how we actually start treating some of the design components that we create.
Cards?
Yes. And all of the variations that can exist with them.
So, first thing to note here, I don't know if anyone here is really familiar with Pattern Lab, but this is, yes, it's Pattern Lab, kind of, but this is not your typical Pattern Lab setup, and that's been one of the most exciting things that we've been exploring. It is still Pattern Lab. This is Pattern Lab 2 for Twig, so we're building this with Drupal 8 and Twig integration in mind from day one. So anything that we build with, the card component, we're thinking, all right, how can we get this same single source of truth, this same single template file, how do we get that wired up and shipped on our actual properties? So that's one aspect of this, but even just the information from like a documentation, what are my options with classes and using like the BEM naming convention, it could be kind of difficult to figure out, all right, I've got a card, great. what are the color options in my card? Like, what are the different variations that are baked into the design system and available for, for anyone to use? So the colors here, that's also dynamic. The sizes, which you can't see because we're on a projector, and there's a very subtle, very light, beautiful box shadow. Elegant box shadow. But the three card sizes that we have here, that's also part of it. Or the different options with your content that you can use with this. Again, with our elegant box shadow, you can't see the outlines, but sometimes our cards need to have images that are inside or that are flush with the outer boundaries. Sometimes we want to reverse them. Sometimes we just want to have the image on top, but we want to have a little cutout clipped from it. Sometimes we don't want the cutout. Sometimes we just want it to be flush. Whole point is, these are all different variations, all different options from one single template file. And every single option that's based on our CSS, based on our Sass, the colors, the sizes, those variations are coming directly from the Sass file that says, I've got these colors available for my cards.
And then if you go into one of the individual cards, or one of the individual card types, you can actually see information about that card.
Oh.
And if you're a developer, you can actually grab the code.
Oh, you know what? There we go. I'm like, I thought I had code in here. So, yes, we still have the Twig, Twig template resource. That is available. Yeah, we have the rendered HTML available. But because there's a lot of different audiences this whole system is intended to provide meaningful information to, not everyone's a developer. Not everyone wants to see the source code. And front-end developers don't copy and paste this. Front-end developers go to the source of truth and say, I want to go extend our basic card component and do stuff with it. So having the ability to change that information contextually is also really important.
Mm-hmm.
One other thing.
This kind of goes with the Paddle Lab 2 Twig integration.
Mm-hmm.
If you are using a base theme, and then you've got your Pega sub theme, and then you've got your specific property sub theme.
Yep.
But the HTML is originally coming from a module, a Twig module that you downloaded. How does it know which template to write when you want to update? Where is that coming from?
It's a good question.
That is a good question.
In that case, we would end up having to override that contrib module's template in one layer of the feed.
But if you didn't need to change the HTML, you'd still have to create a template in your sub theme. And say
If we're wiring it up to a pattern lab provided template,
Yeah.
yes. But if we're happy with the HTML that's rendered by the module, in most cases we won't be, but if we were, then yeah, we would just leave it.
You don't have to do anything with it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
how does it display in your little viewer thing when I want to take a look at?
So that's a good point. It wouldn't display in pattern.
Okay.
So that's what we have to do. So to have the contrib module be properly represented in the design system, we would have to essentially put the HTML into the design system.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
So
No
I
problem.
know I could go on for another half hour
Yeah,
plus,
you could.
but want to open the floor for questions first and foremost?
Anything?
Anything?
Bueller?
Anyone?
Keep going.
Anybody curious how this works with Drupal integration?
Yes.
Or-
All right, I'll let him keep going.
So,
He's gonna sit down.
like I mentioned before, this is Pattern Lab 2 for Twig, but the more I play around with Pattern Lab, the more I realize that really, under the scenes, it's just using Twig, like the same Twig that Drupal's using. and that's not a bad thing. It's easy to make changes to it because of that. It's easy to extend it and help smooth over some of the differences between Pattern Labs, has a couple of Pattern Lab unique conventions, and then a lot of Drupalisms that exist. So there's a lot of functions and filters, and like the grid system, we decided that abstracting our grid system to make it a little bit easier to write and change over time, it would make a lot more sense to not use just like div class equals o dash grid, and
Let's see the drifting part.
So this is not a Drupal 8 site. This is our Pega Developer Network PDN. This is a new landing page that is going to be going out the door really soon. It's a Drupal 7 site. And Drupal 7, because Pega.com and PDN are both these 7 sites, getting all of this system to work and play nicely is a challenge. And from a templating standpoint, from a Twig standpoint, we don't have the ability to use the D7 ported Twig module yet, unfortunately. So it is still a manual process of updating patterns. Same thing applies with Pega.com. These are the new vertical landing pages that we wired up within the first couple months of me being at Pega. The thing is, though, hey Kelly, is it flex page test or flex page?
I don't know that that's even on production.
I think it's when I'm logged in.
Yeah, you definitely probably need to log in. Are you looking for the flex page 2.0?
Yeah. That's all right. Without logging in. Essentially, we're replacing these hard-coded, manually built, giant blob pages with new templates, each of them corresponding with the Twig equivalent, so that D7 can still take advantage of all of the CSS architecture, the JavaScript architecture, the asynchronous icon loading solution that we got here. We can still take advantage of having a design system, even if properties are still moving to Drupal 8. That said, actually, let's do a. There we go. We're working on a single sign-on solution right now. And part of this work, going from Pattern Lab, prototyping, iterating, and moving on to Drupal 8, part of that is involving registration. Look familiar? This is actual Twig. This is actual Drupal 8 wired up, all the different components. I know it's a little hard with the projector to see some of the outlines for the fields here, but in Pattern Lab we have our custom select drop-down component. We have our text input component. We have our label component. We have our button component. All of these patterns exist as individual pieces. Completely oblivious to the fact that Drupal is a thing. And they work fine, and we can iterate and prototype and do what we need to do in Pattern Lab. But when we're building each of those individual pieces, we're also having to keep in mind what is the real data that Drupal, for example, needs in order to make one of these text fields actually work, actually be shippable. So there's definitely, from a architectural, from a planning perspective, there's definitely a bit more planning involved. Here's our sign-up form, just the form itself, none of the pieces behind it. Here, I know it's not possible to see from that far away, but this has been updated. We have a pull request in for the actual Pattern Lab repository, main Pattern Lab core repo. The Drupal 8 way of doing this is using Twig namespaces, at, and then atoms, molecules, organisms, at pattern, and then wherever the actual Twig path is. So that was one of the convention changes from going from the ideal Pattern Lab naming convention for like, how do I pull in a template somewhere, to something that Drupal can out of the box also use. This is using the Drupal component module, which basically says, hey, I'm going to make atoms, molecules, organisms, pages, templates. I'm going to make all of these names correspond with a particular path in my theme. So for PegaKit as a base theme, Drupal 8 knows where the atoms folder is. And then we just do our normal thing in Pattern Lab. And when this particular template gets used, or wants to get used in a real template in Drupal, it knows where to look in our separate Pattern Lab patterns code. Make sense? We're also...
on production,
Yeah.
do you have your Pattern Lab repository sitting right there in parallel with your Drupal repo?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So,
It's separately and combined.
so one missing piece that I might volunteer to add. So the Drupal template layer, the sort of the Drupalism naming conventions like views dash 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 dot unformatted dot TPL, like in Drupal 7, but in Drupal 8 Twig. We're essentially using what's called the model view presenter pattern, and that's where we use that Drupal layer, that Drupal naming convention, just to wire up to Twig templates in Pattern Lab. None of our Drupal templates actually have any HTML in it, and they're simply embedding and then passing the data in to those Pattern Lab templates.
So there's no, besides any modules that might have their own markup, all of the template work that we're doing in the Drupal environment, all of that really is just pointing at the Pattern Lab single source of truth, single template to rule them all, and changing the data so that the way Drupal is expecting everything to be set up and called, and the way that our current take on naming things in Pattern Lab is, both of them get wired up one to one, and they all can play nicely.
Like the Drupal native Twig template will do some, like let's say the Pattern Lab or whatever, it has a variable that's name, but Drupal's providing it as first name, last name. The Drupal template will put them together and then pass them on to Pattern Lab as a single name variable.
Yeah.
That's the presenter layer. We're essentially using the Drupal Twig template layer as just the glue to Pattern Lab.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that as a preprocessor?
No, we're just using Twig.
Okay. So
Yeah,
alright,
Twig-
you're
Twig-
just
Yeah.
Moving it in Twig.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So the whole point of this approach is, if we want to change a class, because one of the biggest pain points with the D7 architecture, or sometimes lack of architecture, is it's very difficult, or can be very difficult, to change things. And given how front-end development tends to like to change and evolve very quickly, having the ability to change classes, change your markup, and not break anything that's you've already shipped is really important. It's one of the core goals in any kind of front-end, back-end architectural solution that we come up with. So, obviously, if I'm changing the name of a parameter, I have to make sure that anything in Drupal is updated to know what to now point to. Obviously, there's a little bit of that, but at the very least, we don't need to worry about, oh, I've got classes scattered in this template here, and then this place here, and then this place here. There's only one place to change the class.
You have to forgive me because I don't know anything about pattern labs, so this might be a really elementary question, but how do you stage these changes? How do you go and make your changes in here without affecting what's currently live? And then how do you export that into your dev instances?
It's a good question. Unfortunately, I goofed, and I was going to bring my laptop in to do a live code example of this, and I left it at my desk about a mile away.
It was never work anyway.
So Pattern Lab, doesn't know about Drupal for the most part. Pattern Lab is it's one tool out of many in our front end development workflow, and Pattern Lab can run 100% independent from Drupal. No database, no server needed, none of that stuff. So it's a local front end development tool and workflow. You can do everything that we're walking through here in Pattern Lab. When I've got some changes, I'll commit them to our Git repository. We have a continuous integration server, so once those changes are okayed, it gets pushed up to the development environment that we have here. Feature branches and merging stuff aside. This for I think a couple reasons actually isn't what automatically gets pulled into any of the Drupal sites. Like the new account site, the register page we had up, that's pulling the exact same code that I have on develop here. But it only is going to get updated when I tell Drupal, hey, go run Composer and update your theme that you're requiring in as a Composer dependency. It only pulls in the latest when I tell Drupal, go update your dependencies. And then it'll grab a version and then put it in the right place in the folder structure. So
yeah, we're using Composer essentially, and each property is pointing to a specific version of the theme.
So it gives us the control, especially when we're actually deploying. We want to deploy stable tagged releases. We can lock what version of the code in Pattern Lab existed at that moment. From a file structure, folder structure point of view, this looks like a Drupal 8 theme. But it can run independently from having any of the Drupalisms available to it.
The only other cool thing that I'll mention that you haven't brought up, I don't think you've brought up yet, the Twig extension compatibility.
Oh, that was a fun figuring out.
Essentially, there's Drupal specific Twig extensions that you expect to be able to use. What's a good one like?
Attribute. So
the attribute class.
Drupal 8 has a attributes.add class function. The Pattern Lab community has been really great with, hey, Drupal's this thing that we can now actually get to the holy grail of front end back end integration. They actually produced a Drupal 8 I think Twig extensions plugin for Pattern Lab. So a lot of the other Drupalisms, attribute, link, couple others, they ported over an equivalent. So you could really use the Drupalism in your code, and Pattern Lab plays nicely with it, even if Drupal doesn't exist when it's running locally.
Like an alias for the T function that you can then use in your Pattern Lab. It doesn't do anything in Pattern Lab, it just kind of passes through the text, but at least then you can still use the template and then translate string constants.
Yeah. I think, this is a cool one. At least I think it's cool. This is using not Drupal's breakpoints and picture module logic and code yet. This is actually using some logic that I have running in Pattern Lab. This whole blob of noise is our Pattern Lab. It's basically a standalone, fully working version of doing responsive images. So, do I want to lazy load my images or not lazy load? Do I, I've got a big image. How many different image cuts do I want to generate to make my file size download as small as possible? How do I optimize those images? How do I so I just deleted the image tag. If this was a normal image, that whole bit of content would just, flap to the top of the page like it normally would. How do I carve out space on the page so that when I'm loading up my images, especially my lazy loaded images, how do I carve up just the right amount of space that's sized to the image that will be loaded so that, if I'm not on a perfect connection, my whole page isn't jumping around. I can actually have my layout pretty much stay intact throughout the whole loading process. There's a lot of features and little details involved in doing, a modern responsive images solution. And, this is a really simple site that we're building for onboarding new users, getting new users to create an account. We don't yet need the full Drupal picture module, breakpoints module, image solution, because we've only got one image, and we already needed to build all this stuff out in Pattern Lab. So Drupal 8 is just using the same tooling, literally the same way that we generate markup on the Pattern Lab side. Drupal is just saying, hey, I've got an image, here's the source. I'm just going to use what Pattern Lab, with some filters and some functions, use what Pattern Lab's doing. So there's definitely a lot of potential with Twig's compatibility with filters, functions, custom tags, and whatnot. Both to just superpower the website, but also to bridge a lot of the gaps between the Drupal conventions and making Pattern Lab still be agnostic, but still play nicely. Any more questions?
What's the future going to be like?
That's a great question.
Describing
Next steps.
So,
Sentient robots in our CSS.
So we're just at the beginning stages of where we want to see our design system go. This new accounts site is, from the very beginning, getting wired up and using the design system. It is the base theme, and we can sub-theme and build off of that.
We have two more sites. One is going to be released by the end of the year, or actually not the end of the year, but February 10th. So we have a blogs. We have our Pega blogs is also being built on Drupal 8. Is also going to be hooked up to the design system, ready to go on February 10th. We also have our learning management system, Pega Academy, moving into its own home on Drupal 8. That's going to be wired up to Academy, and we're going to be moving both Pega.com and PDN to Drupal 8 within the next year. So those are some of the things we have planned, and all of those are going to be Drupal 8 integrated into Pattern Lab from the get-go.
Yeah.
So that the disconnect you see today between the three main sites isn't there anymore.
The templates, especially. Pega.com, it was actually a really great exercise to get the CSS, the JavaScript, the icon loading, a lot of the performance optimizations that exist under the hood. We were able to get pretty much all of those wired up with a lot of the legacy code for Pega.com, but it's still a Drupal 7 site. You still need to update, at least a template in two places in order to get a change deployed out the door. Any of the new architectures using Twig completely eliminate a lot of those particular pain points with the old way of handling this kind of thing. I would say for what's next, it's two big things besides all of the work we have coming in the new year. One, now that we're using Pattern Lab as the single source of truth that is Drupal friendly out of the box from day one, Pattern Lab, I think, becomes a lot more important as kind of a bridger between all the different worlds. Pattern Lab is one tool in the whole front-end toolkit, but it's a lot of what other outsiders see when they think, what is the style guide, what is the design system, what is the visual language. So maintaining Pattern Lab, I think, becomes even more important and making it better and more usable. It's also incredibly important now that the same Twig templates that are powering, our actually shipped products, it's incredibly important that we're maintaining and protecting the patterns that we've now deployed. We don't want to change an existing pattern lab pattern only to realize, oh crap, my Drupal site's now broken because I pulled in the latest changes. So having the ability to very quickly spin up a lightweight version of Drupal right next to Pattern Lab, independent from our full Drupal implementations, all the integrations and a lot of the extra stuff that we have to do on the real sites. We don't need all that for a very lightweight Pattern Lab friendly companion, but we're gonna have to keep Drupal's Drupal, a version of Drupal running when we're making some major Pattern Lab changes to make sure that we're not making any breaking updates as we're actually going through the development process. So it basically introduces just another way of knowing that, yes, my two different platforms are still playing nicely. The last thing, and then I'll shut up, is CSS architecture at this scale is tricky. Right now the design system started out with one single set of, one single architecture, one single code base. Here's our variables, here's our Sass mixins and tools, here's our resets, here's our generic patterns, like our grid system, here's our design components, here's our utility class overrides. All of that stuff is in one single architecture, one single code base. And the idea, ideally, is every property would just use everything that we have in our centralized design system. The reality, though, is that not every website should or needs or wants to look the same. So we want to make sure that we're reusing the parts of the code that we really do want to make sure are shared, but we still leave the door open for the different properties to customize and really expand upon the base, make changes without overriding. So I want to have my base body background. I want that to be FA, maybe as a default in the design system. But another property says, no, I actually need it to be like white when my site gets that. The old school way of handling that kind of small difference between two different pieces of CSS is, oh, just put the default here and then I'll just override that when I pull in that file, which is fine, but take that and then do it over and over again. It basically brings us to where a lot of existing Drupal implementations are, where there's this hodgepodge of overrides and technical debt that accrues, where you're just fighting against this thing over and over again, and it becomes unmaintainable. The right way, the better way of handling that kind of thing is, in the design system, we have an opinion on what our background should be. Background color should be fa. I'm gonna set that as a variable, set that as a default in my Sass, and then on the Drupal side, or not the Drupal side, but the site that's gonna be using the design system, I can pull in that file, but change what that variable is set to when I pull it in. Basically, when you get the code compiled, this site has the default I need, and the design system can set the default to what the default really should be, unless you want to change it. Does that make sense?
You modify it at the local use.
At the local use, you can override the defaults without having to get any extra
without actually overriding.
Without actually overriding it, and without getting the extra cruft of having to override. So you get the best of both worlds.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Salem and Dani. This has been great.
Thank you.
The video and slides will be posted online some point next week.